Man, you love to see it. So we are just a few weeks fresh removed from the trade deadline where a bunch of teams made a lot of noise, and one of the teams that made the biggest splash, biggest acquisition during this deadline, of course, were the Golden State Warriors, as they finally decided to bring in some help for Steph Curry in the likes of Jimmy Butler. Now, we have talked about this story ad nauseum in the offseason, failing to bring in a premier co-star alongside Steph Curry, really close a few times, really dodged a bullet with Paul George, but unfortunately not doing so. First handful of seasons in the season, seemed as if like the Warriors were going to be okay. They were performing really well. A lot of people thought that, hey, who cares about a co-star? Steph Curry, Draymond, that's the core. They're really piecing it together. Buddy Hield emerging as basically a Klay Thompson replacement, performing at levels in which Klay Thompson was shooting at his peak. This is the Warriors and they'll be okay. But unfortunately, things really fell apart. The Warriors went through a really, really tough stretch, and they went from a team that was in the top of the Western Conference all the way into battling for play-in positioning. That's how bad it was for the Warriors. Again, talked about that as well. Rajan brought us to the deadline, swung big, got Jimmy Butler, and boy, has it been a world of difference. Since adding Jimmy Butler, the Warriors have a record of 7-1, an offensive rating of 122, top 5 in the NBA, a defensive rating of 106, second best in the NBA within its 8-game sample size, and a net rating of near 16. Crazy. Third best net rating in the NBA within these 8 games, which effectively means they're not just winning games, they're molly-whopping teams, and that's exactly what's happening. They beat Chicago by 21 points, Milwaukee by 14, Sacramento and Dallas, they beat them by 24, and in Charlotte, they completely annihilated them with a 36-point blowout. And what really pushed me to make this video is their win against the Orlando Magic, where they were down, I believe, by 15 or 17 points after the first half. However, still came back, won the game by 6, and Steph Curry looked as great as he's ever looked in probably the last year or two, putting up 56 points. The shot making was amazing. It was spectacular. And boy, oh boy, is it great to see Curry win. Which then, of course, breeds the question on how good are the Golden State Warriors? What does this mean for them long term? And what exactly can we expect from them? Because, of course, the record that they have right now, they're at the bottom of the conference, or at least the bottom of the playoff spot, probably going to fight for the 6th seed. But, of course, as we all know, their record no longer indicates how good this team actually is. Bringing in Jimmy Butler is a significant upgrade in talent. And like I said, when they acquired Jimmy Butler, he is not the same Jimmy that we saw out in Miami. He's going to have instant and immediate impact. This is going to be a team where Jimmy is not going to be asked to do the heavy lifting as often as he has been doing out in Miami. But more importantly, a team that has a significantly higher ceiling in terms of some of the players that surround him, and thus being met with significant different expectations and standards. So first, what does this mean for the Warriors? Well, individually, a lot of these players, I do believe, will continue to play much better basketball with the addition of Jimmy Butler, and that's something that we have seen post the trade. Several increase in production from a lot of these players, in particular Quentin Post and B-Pods. For those who aren't aware of QP out there, flexible forward, spaces out the floor, a young up-and-coming player for the Golden State Warriors. It seems as if like they kind of found a gem out there, but both of them have looked significantly better, and that makes sense. A lot of the supporting cast members are going to add way more because they're being asked to do way less and just be more complimentary instead of trying to take on a bit more responsibility. Also, Kuminga, who we have not seen yet with this team, paired with Draymond defensively, they're going to make significant strides. Looking at Draymond when he's on the floor, they have a defensive rating of 102 post the Jimmy Butler trade, net rating of 20, and then some of these numbers have even been seen with Jimmy Butler as well post the trade. Defensively, this team is going to be miraculous. Adding Kuminga also is going to be really, really great for this team as well. And more importantly, when it comes to Kuminga, very similar to QP and B-Pods, he's going to be asked to do even less because it's very clear and evident that Kuminga just wasn't going to be able to live up to the expectations, and he needed another creator, another generator. And speaking of which, Jimmy Butler, who he has been on this team, has been a revelation. The numbers themselves, at least from a scoring standpoint, haven't been the greatest, to be fair. Overall, his stats since the trade, he's only averaging 16 points, 5 to 6 rebounds, 5 to 6 assists, and shooting splits, in particular with his three-point shooting, hasn't been the greatest, but it's not necessarily about what he's producing rather than the threat that he presents to the opposing team, because now there is another player on the floor that can generate a quality shot, put pressure on the defense, which again makes it easier for everyone else. Now, what exactly does this mean? Expectations moving forward, and how far do I believe this team can go in the playoffs? I'm not sold on that just yet. Even though these wins are very convincing, they're also against teams that aren't that impressive. Chicago Bulls, I don't know. The Milwaukee Bucks, I believe, without Giannis, I don't know. Sacramento, Dallas, Charlotte, I don't know. These are really good wins, and you're supposed to beat the teams that are in front of you, but these aren't good enough wins for me to like really submit this idea that, oh, the Warriors, they're going all the way, because I do see a lot of people saying that. And even though, yes, the offense is moving much more fluent, much more easier, and I do believe the defensive ceiling is right back to where it once was early in the season when Wiggins was there and you had Kuminga still performing at a really high level alongside Draymond Green. That all still exists. However, this Western Conference, it's a doozy. It's really, really difficult to kind of navigate through, and I'm just not sure that I'm going to be ready to commit to this idea that you have a team that made a midseason addition that's going to be able to compete with the Oklahoma City Thunder team that has performed at all-time great highs. Denver has really started to turn around as well. The Lakers, for a much larger sample size, has looked just as good in many ways when it comes to the Warriors, and then a bunch of other teams that have really cemented themselves with just better chemistry and continuity. However, I will say no one wants to face this team in the first round because the ceiling is significantly higher than, again, the record would imply. So I'm not necessarily sold on them just yet, but I will say the one thing I am sold on is the improvement of Steph Curry, and I think that's probably the biggest takeaway of not only this video, but the addition of Jimmy Butler. There was a lot of conversation and dialogue around Steph Curry and who he was as a player heading into the season and going forward once more into another regular season without adding a co-star, and how would Curry respond to that? Because towards the tail end of last season, Curry struggled mightily to just be a consistent scoring threat due to their increased offensive workload that he had post, Jordan Poole no longer being there and then Klay Thompson regressing as well. So there's going to be a lot of, and I do mean a lot of responsibility placed on his shoulders. Buddy Hield came out this season on fire. Andrew Wiggins was knocking out his shot. Draymond, I believe, he was shooting like 40% from three as well, and they were facing fairly easy competition. So the bar was set, and I think a lot of people got a little bit too excited about what to expect from Curry, because you could still see Curry in his game was still fairly inconsistent, even in the early stages of the season. So once Buddy Hield started to cool down in junction with both B-Pods and Kuminga not necessarily taking that leap that many people expected, the Warriors, and in particular who Curry truly was as a player, started to reveal itself, and it didn't look too great. However, there was still hope from a lot of people that Curry was still an elite level player who could perform at really high heights, and the numbers that we saw out of him shouldn't be that much of a representation of who he actually was, rather than the lack of help that surrounded him. And those numbers leading up into the Jimmy Butler trade, Curry was only averaging 22 points, 4.5 rebounds, 6 assists, and the shooting splits were respectable for someone his age and size, 44% from the field, 40% from behind the arc, 94% from the free throw line, 60% true shooting, which is all respectable, but clearly not enough to carry a team that was lacking in an offensive threat. It clearly just wasn't enough. However, since this trade, you can clearly see Curry is a completely different player. The threat of him being on the floor can really be carried out with him having another offensive weapon next to him, and the numbers show it as well. Since the trade, Curry is averaging 31 points, 4 rebounds, 5 assists, and shooting splits of 51, 43, and 90. A true shooting percentage of 70%, which is also crazy. Now, you could very well argue, hey, small sample size, we probably should be a bit more responsible instead of going crazy and making these outlandish takes off of 8 games, and that's fair. However, to put things into further context, we have not seen Curry play this well, even in a small 8-game sample size, since literally a calendar year ago. Literally last year, around this time in February, is the last time that Curry's been able to average 30 points per game, even within 8 games. So we haven't seen that in a very, very long time from Curry. And it's very important to note that, because that version of Curry was not only the reason why optimism was so high out with the Golden State Warrior fan base and everyone that's in that organization, but more importantly, was basically a necessity, right? Like once Klay was gone, Poole, again, he was gone, Curry was out there having to generate a lot of offense, not only for himself, but from everyone else. So Curry had to perform like this, and it was clear that these stretches of Curry were becoming more and more rare as time progressed, because he's getting older. The inconsistency started to become more consistent, and the clear, and I do mean clear, lack of offensive help that surrounded him made it easier to defend the Golden State Warriors for most of this season. And so yes, an 8-game sample size, that right there, a bit irresponsible of me to even throw these numbers out there, but it is still very important to highlight that he has not looked this great in an 8-game sample size since last calendar year. That's how bad it's been for Curry, even in a small sample size. And so if there is a big takeaway from this, it may not be how far they're going to go in the postseason. You may now be aware of some of the role players, supporting cast members, the younger players playing slightly better now that Jimmy Butler is on the team. But more importantly, it's who Curry is as a player, because that is the true difference maker for what this team needs moving forward, even even beyond this season. The Warriors need further secure an insurance knowing that Steph Curry can still perform at these levels as long as you keep the proper talent around him, which makes sense because the brother is 36, about to be 37 years old. And I said this all season long, beginning of the season, preseason, all the way up to the deadline. It is malpractice. It is irresponsible to allow someone like Curry to go into the season without any help. You swung on Paul George, you turn your nose to Zach LaVine, you were hesitant to trade B-Pods for Larry Marketing, so the necessity became so undeniable that one could argue that you were a bit desperate. But at bare minimum, do something. And I'm happy that they did because we now know Curry is still Curry. The numbers that he was posting up earlier this season, I refuse to believe that is a true representation of who he is. It's probably much closer to what we've seen out of him since the Jimmy Butler trade. And I hope he goes out there and continue to put up these numbers. And if anything, what happened in Orlando is the exact reason why I wanted to make this video, because Orlando is a playoff team. High intensity defense makes it difficult for you to go out there and score against them. So it made sense that early on, the Warriors were struggling to score against them. It made sense that they were down by 17 points. And it still also makes sense that Curry was able to single-handedly bring them back into this game because he had the ability of doing so due to his workload being substantially less than it was before. Because if you look at the numbers in this Orlando game, Curry carried. Like, when you look at the numbers, Jimmy Butler was 1 for 7, Moses Moody 1 for 5, Buddy Hield 1 for 5, B-Pods 3 for 12. Like, no one's really putting up the numbers that were necessary. And that's who the Warriors have been all this season. Like, this level of performance offensively is what you can get. But the difference is now that 56 next to Curry's name, the 12 for 19 shooting from 3 next to Curry's name, the 16 for 25 from the field next to Curry's name. The fact that Curry could even attempt 25 shots, 19 of them being threes. The fact that Curry at his age could have the ability to do that has a lot to do with the fact that they now added Jimmy Butler to the roster, and he's been able to help him navigate through a lot of tough defensive schemes that you could see from a team like the Orlando Magic. And I just don't believe that he would have been able to pull that off if Jimmy Butler wasn't on the roster. I don't believe he would have been able to pull that off if GP2 was in that starting lineup or Buddy Hield was in that starting lineup, because that means that he would have to have navigated that defense all night long effectively by himself. But even when Jimmy is having a bad shooting night, even when Jimmy is not, playoff Jimmy, or even if Jimmy isn't able to perform at a certain level, it's still the threat of having someone else on the floor really does alleviate a lot of that defensive pressure that can be placed on Curry any given night that we saw from many teams before this trade. So if there's one thing I definitely can guarantee, it's more performances like this, more stretches that we're seeing is more than likely going to happen from Curry. What it will amount to, who knows? But it is great to see that not only are the Warriors back at playing at a much higher level, but more importantly, Curry is still Curry. He's playing at a significantly higher level, and Curry with Draymond and Jimmy Butler in the playoffs, who knows? Who knows? But hey, those are my thoughts. Please let me know yours in the comment section below. Hit the subscribe button, notification bell, and until next time, I'll see you all later. Peace.